Matt Jameson never thought of himself as a landowner in the traditional sense. He had grown up in Chicago, where vineyards were something you read about in glossy travel magazines, not something you lived among. And for most of his life he had been content to build a career as a civil engineer, working on infrastructure, projects that were more about concrete and steel than about sunlit hillsides and soil. But everything shifted when he inherited a forgotten piece of property in Sonoma County from his late Aunt Eleanor, a woman he had only met a handful of times as a child and whose eccentricities were the subject of whispered family anecdotes. She had been the kind of relative who never married, who invested her time and energy into experiments with grapes and soil instead of children and family gatherings, and though Matt barely knew her, she had left him a legacy that he could not ignore. At first it felt like a burden, a crumbling farmhouse and acres of land that had been neglected for too long. But as he stood on the ridge the first time he visited, looking down at the old vines twisted and gnarled yet somehow still alive, he felt a spark of something he hadn't expected, the urge to preserve, to rebuild, to give shape to something lasting rather than temporary. His wife, Brianna, Bree to anyone who knew her, was a county land commissioner, the sort of professional who knew every zoning map by heart and had built her reputation on being both unshakably ethical and ruthlessly competent. The irony of her husband suddenly becoming a vineyard owner was not lost on either of them, and early on they made an unspoken agreement. Her work would remain hers, his vineyard his. They would not mix her public role with his private experiment, not only to avoid accusations of conflict of interest, but also to protect their marriage from the corrosive stress of politics. Still, her presence was a comfort to him, a steady reminder that land could be more than dirt and paperwork, that it could hold memory and identity if treated with respect. Matt spent months slowly reclaiming the property. The barn was roofless in places, the irrigation system outdated, and the vines themselves looked more like weathered bones than living plants, but he threw himself into the work as if by salvaging them he could salvage something within himself. His engineering background made him methodical, and he kept detailed journals about soil pH, slope erosion, and the effect of coastal fog on the microclimate. It was grueling and lonely labor, often performed in silence with only the wind rattling the dry leaves around him, but there were moments when the air seemed to hum with possibility, as though the land itself recognized his efforts and granted him a patience. He began to see the vineyard as not just an inheritance but a chance to root himself in a world that had always felt transient. The neighbors treated him with polite curiosity at first. A few stopped by to drop off pies or offer advice that often sounded more like warnings. Keep the gullies clear, watch the drainage after spring storms, don't trust everyone who says they're here to help. It wasn't hostility, not exactly, but it wasn't warmth either, as though the land carried its own unspoken history and anyone new would have to earn their place. Matt didn't mind. He liked being the outsider who slowly learned the rhythm of the valley, the way mornings began with mist heavy enough to blur the edges of the hills, and evenings settled with a silence so complete it could press against the chest. He imagined Eleanor watching him from some invisible perch, smirking at the nephew who once scoffed at farm life but now dirtied his hands every day with pruning shears and calloused palms. There was no single moment when the vineyard transformed from a burden into a home, but rather a series of small recognitions. The first time a vine he had cut back sprouted new green shoots, the afternoon when he heard his wife laugh in the half-collapsed farmhouse because she had found an old journal of Eleanor's filled with meticulous notes about fermentation experiments, the evening when he stood with a glass of cheap supermarket wine and promised himself that one day his own grapes would produce something worth savoring. These moments accumulated into a quiet conviction that he belonged there, that the vineyard was not a mistake of inheritance but a deliberate passing of torch from one solitary soul to another. For Bree, watching him sink into the land was both heartening and unsettling. She admired his dedication, but she knew better than most that land in this county was never just land. It was a battlefield of competing interests. Developers pushing for luxury resorts, environmentalists guarding every oak tree, old farming families clinging to traditions, and county officials caught in the crossfire of permits and lawsuits. She kept her professional worries to herself, never wanting to dampen his newfound purpose, but at night she sometimes lay awake, wondering if Eleanor had truly left him a gift or a trap. By the end of the first year, Matt had stopped thinking of himself as an outsider. The vines had not yet yielded a harvest worth bottling, but they had begun to breathe again, and so had he. He started sketching plans for a small tasting room. Nothing flashy, just a place where someday people could walk the rows of vines and understand what it meant to wrestle beauty from weather and stone. He felt, for the first time in years, that his life was not just about deadlines and blueprints, but about something elemental and enduring. And though he could not name it, there was a sense beneath all his optimism that the Vineyard, with its tangled past and precarious future, was not finished testing him. The morning the machines came was unnervingly ordinary at first, one of those pale California dawns when the sky held a color that could not decide between gold and gray, when fog clung stubbornly to the valley floor and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and cold metal. Matt had been in the barn tinkering with the irrigation pump, distracted by the steady hiss of water leaking through a worn gasket, when he felt a vibration ripple across the ground beneath his boots. At first he thought it was a truck rumbling down the distant county road, but within moments the sound grew louder, deeper, the unmistakable guttural churn of diesel engines advancing across terrain not meant to carry them. He stepped outside, wiping grease from his palms with a rag, and froze when he saw two bulldozers rolling slowly up the gravel path that led into his vineyard, their orange frames looming like blunt beasts against the morning fog. There was no call ahead, no letter taped to the gate, no explanation offered. The drivers barely glanced at him as they maneuvered onto the property, as though his presence were incidental, as though they had every right to flatten the land beneath their treads. One of them raised a gloved hand in a half-wave, not greeting but acknowledgement, the way one might gesture to a stranger at a gas station. Matt shouted over the engines, demanding to know what they were doing, but the machines did not pause. They rumbled past the first row of vines, careless of the soil, heavy tracks pressing down the earth that had taken him months to nurture. Only when Matt ran in front of the lead bulldozer and forced it to brake with a shrill hiss did the driver finally cut the engine and open the cab. The man inside looked more bored than hostile, his sunglasses reflecting Matt's furious face, his tone flat as he explained they were here to clear the slope according to coordinates provided by the association. Matt asked which association. And the man shrugged, pointing to a folded packet of papers wedged beside the gearshift. The documents bore county insignia and what appeared to be stamped approvals, though none of them were signed by names Matt recognized. The words Parcel Redevelopment, Phase 1, were scrawled across the top, and beneath it his property was marked in thick red ink, as though it had already ceased to be his. He demanded to know who had authorized this, and the driver, still indifferent, muttered a name. Taylor Gillis, site coordinator for Willow Creek Land Association, before replacing his sunglasses and waiting for Matt to move. Matt's mind reeled. He had never heard of Willow Creek Land Association, had never joined any local body, and he certainly had never agreed to let a stranger dictate the future of his land. He refused to step aside, and eventually the machines retreated with a mechanical groan, their drivers muttering about wasted time and paperwork. But the damage was already done. Not to the soil, but to the fragile sense of security Matt had been building. He watched the bulldozers disappear into fog, his chest tight with a mix of disbelief and rage, the rag still clutched in his hand as if it could shield him from the absurdity of what had just unfolded. That night, after hours of pacing the farmhouse and rereading the strange documents until the words blurred into nonsense, Matt called the number scrawled on the back of one sheet. A receptionist answered brusquely, confirmed that yes, work orders had been filed for his parcel, And no, there was no mistake, because the parcel was under review for reclassification. When he demanded details, she transferred him to a voicemail box that never returned his call. It was Bree who first caught the name Gillis in county records, her fingers tapping across her laptop as she navigated databases she ordinarily would not touch outside official duties. Gillis had filed several requests in quick succession, all vaguely worded, all referencing parcels that bordered one another like pieces of a puzzle. His role was listed not as owner but as acting representative, for a group whose origins were murky, their incorporation papers filed only months earlier in a neighboring county. Matt tried to shake it off as an error, some clerical confusion that would untangle itself with a few stern phone calls, but within days he received a certified envelope that left no room for denial. Inside was a formal notice declaring his land subject to interim development proceedings, accompanied by a schedule of hearings he had never been invited to attend. The wording was slippery, full of phrases like public necessity and temporary stewardship, but the implication was unmistakable. He no longer had sole authority over his vineyard. Even more chilling was the clause at the bottom, warning that obstruction of development efforts could result in fines and possible seizure. The letter bore a printed signature of Taylor Gillis, though no title accompanied it. When he showed Bree the papers, she read them twice, her jaw tightening with each line. She told him carefully that the county commission had never reviewed such a request, that her office had not seen these documents cross their desks, which meant they had been funneled through some side channel designed to bypass scrutiny. She cautioned him against storming into Gillis's office or confronting workers directly again, because without proof of fraud he could be painted as the aggressor, the irrational landowner obstructing progress. The thought infuriated him, that the man who had nurtured this soil with his own hands could be framed as the trespasser while strangers plotted its demolition. The days that followed were thick with unease. Matt noticed unfamiliar trucks idling on the road near his gate, men in reflective vests jotting notes on clipboards while pretending not to watch him. Surveyor stakes appeared overnight along the vineyard's edge, bright plastic ribbons fluttering in the wind like small warnings. He pulled them up and tossed them aside, but by the next evening they were back, aligned with unnerving precision. Neighbors grew distant, some averting their eyes when he greeted them, others offering vague platitudes about changes coming whether we like them or not. Even the land itself seemed unsettled, the vines wilting under sudden infestations of insects, the soil damp in places where no water should have pooled. For Matt, the vineyard had always been a test of endurance, but now it felt like a battlefield, the ground shifting beneath him as invisible hands redrew maps and rewrote histories. He wanted to believe he could fight this with reason, with documents and law, yet every instinct told him he was facing something far less transparent, a machine of interests that did not care whether he was right or wrong. It was not just about his vines, not just about his inheritance, but about the principle of whether a man could stand on land that had been passed to him by blood and labor, and declare it his without being crushed by forces that saw soil only as profit. And though Bree urged patience, caution, restraint, Matt felt something burning in him stronger than fear, a determination that if they wanted his land they would have to take it from his hands while he was still breathing. Matt's first attempt to confront the so-called Willow Creek Land Association left him with the peculiar sensation of stepping into a play where everyone else already knew their lines, and his part had been written without his consent. He drove into town on a cloudless afternoon, carrying with him the crumpled papers delivered in the certified envelope, and followed the address listed for their office, which turned out not to be in any government building or professional complex, but rather a rented suite above a shuttered hardware store on the edge of Main Street. The stairwell smelled of dust and old varnish, and when he pushed open the glass door at the top he was greeted not by the bustle of clerks or the orderliness of a planning board, but by silence. A single receptionist seated behind a chipped counter, flipping through a fashion magazine. She barely looked up as he entered, her expression that of someone accustomed to fending off intruders with the blunt force of apathy. He explained that he had received notice regarding his land, that there must have been some mistake, and he wanted to speak to whoever was responsible. She clicked her pen, asked for his name, then nodded toward a closed door at the end of the hall. Inside, the air was colder, a faint hum of an overworked air conditioner masking the thin walls. Jan, Taylor Gillis, sat behind a desk that was almost offensively empty, as though it had been staged for a photograph. A neat stack of folders, a gleaming brass lamp, a single framed certificate whose lettering was too small to read from across the room. Gillis himself was younger than Matt expected, his features sharp, his hair styled with deliberate precision, and his smile the kind that offered nothing but suggested everything had already been decided. Matt laid the papers on the desk, his voice tight as he demanded an explanation, but Gillis responded with practiced calm, saying the association was simply enforcing development guidelines agreed upon by the community. When Matt pointed out that he had never agreed to anything, that his land had been privately owned for decades, Gillis's smile did not falter. He slid one of the folders across the desk and opened it to reveal maps stamped with recent dates, shaded. Sections marked Redevelopment Corridor. According to these charts, Matt's vineyard was already absorbed into a larger block designated for Sustainable Mixed-Use Expansion. His protest sounded strangely hollow in the sterile room. Every word met, with Gillis's gentle but unyielding deflections. The community voted, the guidelines were approved, the process is transparent. You are, of course, free to seek counsel if you believe an error has occurred. Leaving the office, Matt felt as if he had been dismissed not only as a landowner but as a human being, reduced to a square on a map that could be colored and erased at will. He returned home to find fresh surveyor flags planted along the driveway, their neon colors slicing through the afternoon sun like tiny declarations of conquest. He ripped them out with shaking hands, but by nightfall more appeared, and this time they extended deep into the vineyard rows, as though an invisible army had advanced while he slept. The sense of intrusion gnawed at him, especially when he noticed tire tracks in the soil that did not belong to his truck or tractor. He began locking the gates, patrolling the edges of the property with a flashlight, listening for sounds that might betray another trespass. Bree watched him with quiet worry. She had seen similar tactics in other parts of the county. Gradual encroachment, bureaucratic notices delivered with impeccable timing. The slow transformation of a private holding into a contested site until the owner either sold out or exhausted, himself fighting shadows. She urged him to document everything, to keep a record not only of letters and maps but of every flag, every stake, every footprint. Yet even she admitted that without a clear paper trail of fraud it would be difficult to halt the process. The system thrived on wearing people down, grinding them into submission through endless hearings and delayed appeals, until the land changed hands not by overt theft, but by the slow drip of attrition. Matt tried to follow her advice, photographing each intrusion, collecting the ribbons into a box that soon overflowed, but anger gnawed at the edges of discipline. One evening he returned from the fields to find the lock on his gate broken, the chain hanging loose and muddy tire prints leading up the slope where the soil was soft. He followed the tracks to the north corner of the vineyard where several posts had been uprooted, the vines twisted and left to wither in the sun. There was no note, no explanation, only the silent devastation of months of work undone in an afternoon. He stood there until the light faded, fists clenched, the silence around him feeling heavier than any shouted threat. The next day he tried to report the vandalism to the sheriff's office, but the deputy at the desk listened with polite detachment, scribbled notes, and then explained that without eyewitnesses or identifiable suspects there was a little they could do. When Matt mentioned the name Gillis, the deputy's expression flickered just slightly before returning to neutrality. "Best to handle it through the proper channels," he said, which Matt understood to mean, "Don't expect us to interfere." Word of the dispute seeped into the community, though rarely addressed directly. A neighbor he had spoken to only once approached him at the market and whispered that he should consider selling before matters escalated further, that sometimes it was better to cut your losses than to stand against a tide that would eventually wash you away. Another neighbor, an older man whose family had lived in the valley for generations, simply shook his head when Matt asked if he knew anything about Gillis. "This land remembers," he muttered cryptically, refusing to elaborate. The unease among the locals, their reluctance to speak openly, only deepened Matt's sense that he had stumbled into something larger than himself. A pattern of pressure and silence repeated across parcels until the map bore no resemblance to the land beneath it. That night, Bry found him sitting on the porch with the box of surveyor flags at his feet, staring at the rows of vines swaying in the dark. He admitted for the first time that he was afraid, not of losing money, not even of losing the vineyard, but of being erased, of becoming another nameless case study in how land changes hands while the rightful owner watches helplessly. She reached for his hand and told him he was not alone, that whatever forces stood behind Gillis, they had underestimated what it meant for this particular vineyard to belong to someone who would not vanish quietly. But even as she spoke, Matt wondered how much more he could endure, and whether the escalating pressure was only the beginning of a campaign designed to break not just his claim to the land, but his will to defend it. The breakthrough came not with a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet persistence of Bree, who, despite her earlier warnings about conflicts of interest, could not bear to watch her husband drown beneath the weight of bureaucracy and silence. She had learned long ago that in land disputes the truth was never presented in plain view. It had to be pieced together from scraps, from forgotten files and overlooked signatures, from whispers in hallways and marginal notes on documents no one expected anyone to scrutinize. One evening, after Matt had fallen asleep at the table with maps spread before him and his hand still clutching a pen, she sat at her own laptop and began combing through archival records, navigating the labyrinth of county databases, cross-referencing parcel histories, digging back decades into the analog past where most officials never bothered to look. Hours bled into dawn, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of wind outside, until finally she stumbled upon a set of scanned documents misfiled under a neighboring district. They were hand-drawn maps, weathered and faded, with annotations in Eleanor's handwriting, his late aunt's precise cursive, recognizable even after years. The maps confirmed what Matt had always assumed. The vineyard parcel had been explicitly excluded from community agreements dating back 50 years. Eleanor had petitioned for exemption when the earliest cooperative associations were forming, and the board at that time had granted her request, acknowledging the land's unique geological features and the fact that it had been deeded independently, long before the subdivision sprawled across the valley. The exemption should have carried forward indefinitely, yet in more recent maps the parcel had been absorbed as if the document had never existed. Bree knew what this meant. Someone had deliberately omitted the exemption when the records were digitized, rewriting the parcel's identity with the stroke of a keyboard. The discovery gave her chills. She printed the old documents, careful not to wake Matt, and when he finally stirred she placed them in front of him like evidence from a trial. His eyes widened as he traced the lines of his vineyard marked clearly outside the shaded borders of association land. For the first time in weeks he felt not just anger but a surge of vindication. Proof that he was not delusional, that the ground really had been shifted beneath him by invisible hands. Yet the victory was fragile, because they both knew that in the world of land law, truth was not enough. Truth had to be recognized by a system designed to ignore it. Matt contacted a local attorney, a wiry woman named Dana O'Keefe, who specialized in property disputes. Her office was stacked with files that smelled of mildew, the floor crowded with boxes, but her eyes were sharp, her voice clipped and decisive. She listened carefully as he laid out the sequence of events, examining the notices, the surveyor flags, and finally the archival exemption documents. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, drumming her fingers on the armrest, and said what he already feared. The case was strong, but the timeline was against him. Once a parcel was reclassified and folded into redevelopment proceedings, it took immense effort to reverse the process. Still, she agreed to represent him, her confidence measured but real, and for the first time Matt felt the faint stirrings of an ally beyond Bree. Dana filed an injunction to halt any immediate construction, but before the motion could be heard, more pressure arrived in the form of inspectors. They showed up without warning, armed with clipboards and curt politeness, citing alleged violations on the property: an unsafe barn structure, irrigation lines that supposedly threatened watershed contamination, an unpermitted electrical upgrade in the farmhouse. Matt protested that none of these claims were accurate, but the inspectors were unmoved, snapping photographs and leaving notices pinned to the porch like scarlet letters. It was clear they were not acting independently. Their timing was too precise, their focus too narrow, aimed exactly where it would hurt the most. Even so, the injunction hearing was scheduled, and Matt arrived at the county building with Bree at his side and the box of flags in his truck bed as a symbol of intrusion. The courtroom was small, its walls lined with wood paneling that smelled faintly of polish and age, and as he sat at the petitioner's table he felt both exposed and determined, as though the weight of every vine rested on his shoulders. Gillis was there too, accompanied by a lawyer whose suit was impeccable and whose smile seemed carved from the same unyielding stone as Gillis's. They spoke with polished certainty, describing the development as beneficial to the community, sustainable, modern, inevitable. When Matt rose to speak, his voice trembled at first but grew steadier as he laid out the history, the vandalism, the archival exemption, the flags that multiplied like weeds. He saw a flicker of recognition cross the judge's face when Bree presented the old documents, the kind of flicker that suggested the truth was undeniable even if inconvenient. The ruling did not end the war, but it halted the immediate destruction. The injunction was granted, freezing development until the exemption's validity could be fully reviewed. Matt exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding, gripping Bree's hand so tightly that her fingers ached. Yet, as they walked out of the courthouse, Dana warned them that this was only a pause, not a resolution. Developers rarely retreated after a single setback. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back sharper. That night the vineyard was quieter than usual, the rows of vines standing in the dim light like silent witnesses. Matt walked between them, running his hands along the leaves, and felt the weight of both victory and dread. For every document they had uncovered, for every legal foothold they had secured, there was a force on the other side ready to erase it, to grind him down until he yielded. Still, the discovery of the exemption had shifted the balance. No longer was he merely defending his land with desperation. Now he had proof, a weapon forged from the very history of the soil. And in that moment, beneath the silent sky, he swore he would not let them steal it, even if it meant burning through every ounce of strength he possessed. The injunction brought a moment of fragile relief, but Matt quickly learned that victories in such battles carried hidden costs, for the enemy never conceded ground without planting new traps. Within a week of the judge's order, he noticed the first signs that the campaign against him had shifted from paperwork to attrition. The vineyard, which had been showing the tentative health of early summer growth, suddenly seemed plagued by small but unnerving changes. Leaves curled without clear cause, patches of soil appeared strangely damp after nights with no rain, and a faint chemical odor drifted on the morning air when he walked the rows. At first he thought it was his imagination, the paranoia of a man too immersed in a fight, but when Bree joined him one evening she wrinkled her nose and confirmed the acrid tang that did not belong to any fertilizer they used. Soon after, an envelope appeared nailed to the farmhouse door, this time not with the bland legal jargon of previous notices, but with an unmistakable tone of menace cloaked in official language. It was a preliminary demolition assessment, citing potential structural instability of the barn and recommending its removal before any harm came to visitors or workers. The irony was suffocating. They had labeled him both a trespasser on his own soil and simultaneously a negligent host of a property he supposedly no longer controlled. He called Dana, who sighed heavily over the phone and told him to photograph everything, to preserve every detail because the pattern was obvious. He was being buried not with bulldozers, but with paper, each sheet another stone added to the wall. Surrounding him, the psychological weight deepened when physical sabotage joined the fray. One morning, Matt found the pump house broken into, the irrigation line slashed with a sharp blade, water pooling into the dirt like blood. The damage was deliberate, efficient, done by someone who knew exactly how to cripple the system with minimal effort. He reported it to the sheriff again, but the deputy who arrived walked the scene with the disinterest of a man cataloging routine vandalism. He asked a few perfunctory questions, filled out a form, and left with the assurance that someone will look into it. Matt knew no one would. The message was clear. He was on his own. Bree's position at the county only sharpened the tension. Rumors began to circulate in hushed voices at meetings she attended, insinuations that she was abusing her role to protect her husband's property, even though she had formally recused herself from any proceedings touching his case. Anonymous complaints were filed against her, alleging conflicts of interest, each one dismissed but each one chipping away at her standing. It was as though the same invisible hand that planted flags in Matt's vineyard was also planting seeds of doubt in her professional soil. One evening, she confessed to him that she had been advised quietly by a colleague to consider stepping aside altogether, that her continued presence would only complicate matters. The suggestion carried the stench of blackmail disguised as counsel. Matt tried to shoulder the burden alone, but the isolation pressed harder with each passing week. Neighbors who once offered small courtesies now crossed the street to avoid conversation, their eyes sliding away with guilty evasiveness. He understood the silence. They were afraid of becoming targets themselves, but the betrayal still cut deep. The only signs of defiance came from the land itself, stubborn vines that refused to die even when trampled, shoots of green that pushed up through soil left muddy and poisoned. He began to see the vineyard as a reflection of himself, battered yet not surrendered, clinging to life through sheer insistence. The pressure reached a breaking point when heavy machinery returned, not to flatten his land but to encircle it. He woke one morning to the roar of engines and found graders working along the county road, carving ditches that bled onto his property, redirecting water flow so that runoff collected in shallow pools among his vines. When he confronted the crew chief, the man handed him a laminated permit signed again by Gillis, authorizing erosion control measures. The smug efficiency of the paperwork nearly undid him. He shouted until his throat ached, but the men continued their work, indifferent to his rage. By evening, gullies scarred the edges of his vineyard, and the soil he had tended with such care had become a muddy wasteland. It was Bree who steadied him when despair threatened to break his resolve. She reminded him of Eleanor's exemption, of the judge's injunction, of the fact that every assault only strengthened their case by exposing the lengths to which their adversaries would go. Yet, even as she spoke, her voice carried the weight of exhaustion, for she too was bleeding slowly under the assault of rumors and isolation. They were two people against a faceless machine that had no single villain to strike, only endless agents, each replaceable, each carrying the same polished indifference. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the vineyard lay quiet beneath the bruised sky, Matt stood at the northern slope and watched as distant headlights moved slowly along the ridge. He knew they were surveying again, marking his land for a future that did not include him. He felt the helpless fury of a man watching his life measured and priced by strangers who had never touched the soil with their bare hands. Yet beneath the fury was something colder, sharper, the recognition that if the vineyard was to survive, he could no longer simply defend. He would have to strike back, not with fists or shouted words, but with the same cunning precision his enemies used against him. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine not just enduring the war, but waging it, turning their weapons against them, and showing them that some land was not meant to be surrendered. The day of reckoning arrived not with ceremony but with the grind of engines, the same guttural growl that had first pierced Matt's mornings months earlier. He awoke to it before dawn, a vibration in the floorboards of the farmhouse that made the glassware tremble and the dog bark with unease. When he stepped outside, still pulling on his boots, the vineyard was lit by the harsh glare of floodlights mounted on heavy machinery. Bulldozers and excavators lined the southern slope, their steel arms already angled toward the earth like weapons waiting to strike. Men in reflective vests moved briskly, their gestures clipped and purposeful, as though every minute had been rehearsed in advance. Matt strode down the hill, his breath sharp in the cold air, shouting to halt the work. No one acknowledged him. The roar of the diesel drowned his words, the air thick with exhaust and dust. He pushed past a pair of workers and planted himself in front of the lead bulldozer, hands raised, daring the driver to move. For a long moment the engine idled, the machine looming over him, and he thought they might run him down just to prove the inevitability of their progress. But before the driver could act, a convoy of county vehicles arrived, tires crunching over gravel, headlights cutting through the dust. Out stepped Bree, not in her role as commissioner, for she had resigned weeks earlier to free herself from the accusations of bias, but as a woman who had refused to let her husband face this alone. She was flanked by federal investigators whose badges gleamed in the stark light, and behind them a small cluster of journalists who had been quietly invited, not to amplify drama, but to bear witness. Bree's voice cut across the clamor, steady and sharp, commanding silence in a way Matt had never heard before. She held in her hands the documents they had fought so hard to uncover: Eleanor's original exemption, the corrupted maps, the forged filings that Gillis had used to justify his scheme. She laid them out not on a courtroom table but on the hood of a county vehicle, a makeshift altar to truth. The investigators confirmed what the papers revealed, that the association had funneled fraudulent requests through shell companies, disguising ownership, manipulating boundaries, and laundering signatures until private land appeared as communal, property ripe for redevelopment. Gillis, standing off to the side with his lawyer, tried to protest, his voice brittle with forced composure, but the lead investigator silenced him with a clipped reminder that forgery and conspiracy carried criminal weight. The worksite descended into chaos. Some of the crew shut down their machines, stepping back uncertainly, while others argued, waiving contracts and permits that moments ago seemed unassailable but now looked like flimsy props in a farce collapsing under its own weight. Matt felt the tension in his chest loosen as though a vice had finally been pried open. For months he had fought shadows, unseen forces that erased his rights with impunity, and now the shadows had names, faces, and crimes too brazen to ignore. But even in victory, the moment was raw and perilous. Gillis, cornered and desperate, lashed out with words sharp as blades, accusing Matt of orchestrating the entire drama to inflate the value of his failing vineyard, claiming Bree had betrayed her office, accusing the investigators of political theater. His words spilled into the air like poison, but for the first time they carried no power. The floodlights illuminated not inevitability, but exposure, every lie unraveling beneath the weight of evidence. When the federal agents stepped forward and placed Gillis under arrest, the sight of his hands cuffed behind his back felt less like triumph than release, a knot untangled after months of suffocation. Matt stood in the dirt of his vineyard, his boots heavy with mud, watching as the machinery fell silent one by one, their engines sputtering into uneasy stillness. The vines stretched out before him, battered and scarred, yet alive, their leaves trembling in the night air as if sharing his breath. He realized then that the fight had never been only about boundaries on a map or signatures on a deed, but about whether land could still belong to those who cared for it, who nurtured it not as a commodity, but as a legacy. And in that instant, as the dust settled and the first streaks of dawn lit the horizon, he knew they had preserved more than soil. They had preserved the right to exist without being erased. In the weeks that followed the arrest, the vineyard settled into a silence that felt almost alien after months of intrusion, as if the land itself were exhaling for the first time in years. The flags disappeared, the trucks stopped circling the roads, and the neighbors who had once avoided Matt's eyes now approached hesitantly, offering quiet words of support, apologies wrapped in awkward gestures, and sometimes nothing more than a nod that acknowledged the ordeal he had endured. He accepted it without resentment, understanding that fear had silenced them, and that silence had been the very currency Gillis and his kind depended on. Now that the scheme had collapsed, the fear began to loosen its hold on the valley. Bree, though weary from the strain of resigning her post and exposing herself to scrutiny, found a new role as a consultant for the federal inquiry that had widened far beyond Willow Creek. Her expertise became a weapon in dismantling similar schemes elsewhere, and though she had once sworn never to blur the lines between her work and her marriage, she admitted privately that this fight had been as much hers as his. Together they had defended not just property but the principle that stewardship and honesty mattered more than manipulation. For Matt, the vineyard became more than a battlefield. It became a sanctuary reclaimed. He repaired the torn irrigation lines, re-staked the vines, and with each task felt the weight of survival turning slowly into the rhythm of creation again. He began to plan not only for harvest but for opening the land to others, imagining an educational plot where young winemakers could learn the craft without the shadow of corporate greed looming overhead. It was Bree who encouraged the idea, reminding him that legacy was not measured only by what you preserved, but by what you passed on. On a late summer evening, as the sun spilled bronze light across the rows and the hills glowed with warmth, Matt stood with Bree at the ridge where he had first questioned whether the inheritance was a gift or a trap. The vines rustled softly in the breeze, carrying the scent of earth and growth, and he realized that what had nearly been taken from him had in fact been remade stronger. The vineyard would always bear the scars of the fight, but those scars were proof that it had survived, just as he and Bree had. And in that moment, watching the valley stretch outward in quiet resilience, he felt not the weight of loss, but the unshakable certainty of belonging.